Hi, Rita Lee, and you're listening to my friend Friar.
Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me and my friend the Friar, Father Stephen Sanchez, a discalced Carmelite priest. Good morning, Father.
Good morning.
Are y'all avoiding germs, like the flu and stuff? Because I hear it's going around.
It is everywhere. And unfortunately, those of us in ministry don't have that luxury.
Of avoiding it. Yeah. Those of us with children don't either. So Sophia came home yesterday. She's like, I don't feel good. And then all night long she's been hacking and coughing. So I'm just like, unclean, go to your room. Stay away from me. Don't touch me.
I can't afford to be sick.
Yeah, no joke. So then before we get started and try and wrap up our
We're not going to wrap up today.
You don't think so?
No.
Okay. Well,
I don't think so.
As we move toward
the
conclusion
maybe
of Lumen Gentium, chapter 8, Article 8.
Yeah, chapter 8.
I didn't want to say something. Again, I want to say something about an interaction I had with my mom, and I thought it was really, I don't know. I thought it was something for me to consider, and maybe it's something for you and anyone who listens to consider. And I asked her if hey, is this okay if I talk with Father Stephen about it? And she's like, yeah, that's fine. So I went down. Her birthday was the other day. She just turned 70 just a couple weeks ago, and or a couple days ago. Yeah, this is the 18th of January, so just a little bit ago. And I was down there, I was sitting with her and chit-chatting, and I always carry my rosary in my pocket. And I was telling her the other day I was looking at the crucifix part of the rosary, and I was thinking about how Christ uses the things that take place in our life to draw us near to Him.
Mm-hmm.
And I was reflecting on that, and I was reflecting on what it must have been like to be at the foot of the cross, to see Him, unable to move and all that kind of stuff, and in pain and, everything. And for some reason, it made me think of my mom, because she has difficulty moving and her body hurts and all that kind of stuff. And I thought, I've been reading about some of the martyrs and the early Christians and stuff, and how they like longed for martyrdom, right? If they would even write like, I hope I get to suffer and die like Christ. And so all those kind of thoughts kind of connected in my head, and I thought to myself, I imagine how frustrating it is, for my mom. Like for me, if I couldn't move all of a sudden, I would be pretty frustrated, right? But how beautiful to be able, in some way, to suffer alongside Jesus and to experience part of what He must have experienced on the cross. And so it was just a really kind of interesting kind of contemplation, and we ended up, my mom and I, at the end of just kind of hanging out and talking, I told her I was going to get her a crucifix for her wall, for her bedroom. So when she's, sitting there, laying there, and kind of in the silence of her own mind kind of thing, that she'd be able to reflect on it too. And she said she'd like that. So anyway, just a thought, like I said, I wanted to share with you and see kind of, maybe it's helpful for you. Maybe it's helpful for someone else out there who's going through some hard times.
I think there is a document that the church put out on suffering. The idea of sharing suffering with others, or uniting it to the cross. Part of that on the psychological side is to get us out of our own self. Mm-hmm. So part of the healthy side, the psychological side, is that it helps me to remove my attention upon myself. It's not I'm not locked up in the bubble of myself. And then by turning it around and uniting it to the suffering of Christ and making it therefore redemptive, is that this suffering, whatever it might be, whether it's, your mom, dealing with her situation right now, struggling, the idea of, my body is not answering to my will, that struggle kind of, right? You can't talk, you can't move, these things, which is very frustrating, right? So part of that then is that I offer it up for all those who, whatever the offering is for. Therefore, what it makes it's redemptive in that it makes, by joining it to the suffering of Christ, and by that we mean by being other-centered. Christ's suffering was not for himself, but for us, because he didn't have to suffer, right? Because he was true God, true man. So part of the spiritual side, without getting deep into another 2-hour discussion on suffering, I think it's very helpful, but I think it's a matter of learning to move away from our self-preoccupation and joining it, to the suffering of Christ. And we talk about, suffering for Christ. But that happens not necessarily with the idea of, I want to suffer. It is a matter of, I accept the suffering that comes to me, right? And joining it to Christ. Even though there are saints that talk about, I want to suffer. But that's the language that we use. But the reality is other than that, in that, for example, the example that I've used before is, as I stand outside of a family and I look at the family, and the suffering that I see is, having to go to work, having to provide for the children that are ungrateful, having to change diapers, having to feed them, having to send them to school, and getting up and doing all this stuff for them. From the outside, it looks as if it's suffering, but within that particular reality that I am not a part of, it is not suffering. It is a gesture of love. And so that is the difference. The difference is we talk about suffering, but the person that is in love with Christ doesn't see it as suffering. The person that is in love with Christ sees it as a gesture of love for Christ and for the church that Christ loves. So it's a matter of perspective. And so I always tell people, suffering for the sake of suffering is pathological, and God does not want that. God does not want that.
Yeah.
It's a matter of, where are you in your relationship with the Lord, right? And so this then is the understanding that we should have. That is why, for example, if you remember in Chirp, the gospel that we have for the evening before on Saturday, the gospel of the institution, right? And we have Jesus washing the feet, and where we have Peter unable to accept the fact that Jesus is doing something so humiliating, because Peter sees it outside of the relationship. Jesus is in the relationship, and he doesn't see it as humiliating. He sees it as a gesture of intimacy and love. Same thing here with the suffering. It is a matter of, where are you in your relationship with Christ? The deeper you are in that relationship with Christ, suffering is not suffering. Suffering is a gesture of love that you make towards Christ and also towards his church, whom he loves. And therefore you love because Christ loves. And it is a gesture of love for the community outside of myself. So,
and it's kind of an interesting, it's a good contemplation, I think, when it comes now to segue back into our topic, Mary, because, we love at best dimly, right? Because of our sin.
right.
And, and how great is her love because it's not encumbered by that sin. And equally, like, how great must her suffering have been to, like, watch her son be crucified and
Right.
all that kind of stuff. And so I think where we left off last time, it was kind of this comparison between how Eve it was like Eve's obedience was undone by Mary's obedience.
Right. So excellent segue.
Thank you.
So speaking of the image that you brought up of Mary at the foot of the cross, right? Again, this whole idea of faith and Mary as the archetype of what it is to be a disciple, a faithful disciple. And so let's go to Articles 57 and 58 of Lumen Gentium, chapter 8, on Our Lady. So one of the things that the Council Fathers present to us is that Mary is the archetype of the Pilgrim Church's journey of faith. Now, archetype, we're not talking about a psychological archetype. We're not talking about Jungian archetype. Here, by archetype, we mean model and example, right? This is the model and example. For example, in The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf is the archetype of the wisdom figure, right? Gandalf is the sage. Gandalf is the wisdom figure. So he is the archetype. He is the model and example of what it is to be wise. Aragorn is the archetype of healthy masculinity, right? The healthy king, right? So what we mean by archetype is the model and example, right? So the Council Fathers are saying that Mary is the model and example of what it is to be a faithful pilgrim. Excuse me. So in Article 57, the Council Fathers say, this is from the Gentium, this union of the mother with the son in the work of salvation is made manifest from the time of Christ's virginal conception up to his death. It is shown, first of all, when Mary, arising in haste to go to visit Elizabeth, is greeted by her as blessed because of her belief in the promise of salvation, and the precursor leaped with joy in the womb of his mother. Okay, pause here. So the union between Mary and the Word made flesh and the work of salvation is that as soon as Mary conceives the Word, first they say in her heart and in her womb, what is the first thing that she does? She ministers. The first thing she does is to go and help, go and take care of her older cousin who is pregnant and in her sixth month, I think, is what the scripture says. So it is, and again, it's not a matter of people don't understand or don't appreciate the difficulty of that ministry, because it's not a matter of, getting on 35 and going up north for an hour or so. It is, we don't know if she walked, because it's not, having, or did they have enough money to hire a donkey, or because you couldn't afford a mule or a horse, because the horse was for warriors and mules were warriors too. So a donkey, could you afford a donkey on, the money that Joseph had from being a carpenter? And then it would take days, and in the heat, and so do you travel, and so there's bandits, and there's all that. This was a very, very difficult undertaking that most of the time we just pass over. We don't think about the difficulty and the act of faith that Mary knew was a dangerous thing. Mary knew it was going to be a very difficult thing, and yet she's moved by the Word to go and attend to her cousin. Okay, so this then is part of that, the union between the mother and the son in the work of salvation in this, what we call the visitation. So continuing on with number 57. This promise of salvation and the precursor, John the Baptist, leaped with joy in the womb of his mother. This union is manifest also at the birth of our Lord, who did not diminish his mother's virginal integrity, but sanctified it, when the Mother of God joyfully showed her firstborn son to the shepherds and magi. When she presented him to the Lord in the temple, making the offering of the poor, she heard Simeon foretelling at the same time that her son would be a sign of contradiction, and that a sword would pierce the mother's soul, that out of many hearts thoughts might be revealed. When the child Jesus was lost, and they had sought him sorrowing, his parents found him in the temple, taking up the things that were his father's business. And they did not understand the word of their son. His mother indeed kept these things to be pondered over in her heart. So these are all examples of what it is to be a pilgrim disciple in faith. So the idea of Mary giving birth, the idea of all of a sudden, why are the shepherds here? The shepherds were the marginalized of the society, and the Magi were non-believers or non-Israel, they didn't belong to the covenant. And so for them to come and for her to like, okay, I don't know what this is about. I trust in God's plan. This is part of God's plan unfolding. So I need to be able to enter into that and embrace that. And then at the presentation that we're celebrating tomorrow, so in the feast of the presentation, when the Lord is brought into the temple and fulfilling the law, Mary and Joseph were faithful abiders of the law. And then, to hear Simeon and Anna talk about the baby, and they're like, what? And then this oracle of Simeon, foretelling that her sorrow. So there's all of these are moments of faith, and so it could have been otherwise. And as you said before too, I have absolutely no idea what it's like to be immaculately conceived. I'm not even going to try to guess. But what would our reaction be in those situations if somebody tells me something like this about my child? Or, like, okay, loony dude, he's one of those church people who never leaves the church, and so he's just crazy. So there's a lot of different things that are being presented here by the Council Fathers in terms of Mary's journey of faith.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead.
One of my favorite things about the Christmas narrative is the shepherds, because it was just random one year at Christmas, like the light bulb finally turned on in my head, and I was like, not just that the shepherds were marginalized, but like, what do shepherds protect? Well, they protect the sheep and their lambs, and Jesus is the Lamb of God, so of course God would send shepherds to protect him, kind of thing. And I was just like, what? Mind blown kind of thing.
So did you get up in the middle of Mass and go, I got it.
Yeah, I almost wanted to. It was like, what? Oh my goodness.
God moments, yeah. So continuing on in number 58 of the chapter 8, and again, this is the whole idea of Mary's journey of faith. In the public life of Jesus, Mary makes significant appearances. This is so even at the very beginning, when the marriage feast of Cana, moved with pity, she brought about by her intercession the beginning miracles of Jesus the Messiah. In the course of her son's preaching, she received the words whereby, in extolling a kingdom beyond the calculations and bonds of flesh and blood, he declared blessed those who heard and kept the word of God, as she was faithfully doing. After this manner, the Blessed Virgin advanced in her pilgrimage of faith, and faithfully preserved in her union with her Son onto the cross, where she stood, in keeping with the divine plan, grieving exceedingly with her only begotten Son, uniting herself with a maternal heart with his sacrifice, and lovingly consenting to the immolation of this victim, which she herself had brought forth. Finally, she was given by the same Christ Jesus dying on the cross as a mother to his disciple with these words, "Woman, behold thy son." Okay, so the whole idea of Mary as the model and exemplar of what it is to be a faithful disciple as we journey through space and time as a pilgrim church. So we have here in number 58, well, the first thing that is brought up is the wedding at Cana. And when Jesus says, "Woman, what is this? What is this to you and I?" I mean,
yeah, my time is not coming.
My time is not coming. What? Right? And Mary's response is, "Do whatever he tells you." She had faith, right? She had faith in this son, and she had faith in this situation, right? And so there's a lot of things going on here. in this sign. We're talking about John's gospel, so John doesn't use the word miracle; he uses the word sign. So the sign here is about one. When we talked about the wedding cup in the Jewish marriage ceremony, right?
Yeah.
The whole idea of wine. Wine is joyful. Wine is part of the wedding banquet. Wine for then also is being presented to us as Eucharist. It is the blood of Christ, right? And it is this new wine. And so as the ablutions, all the water that is used for all the ceremonial cleansing is done away with and replaced with wine, is replaced with the sacraments. And so this is the way we would understand it. Then that there's something here. There is a faith stance here that Mary is not just Mary, but Mary is also at this moment then an image and model of the church, the believing community, right? So there's a lot going on in this sign that the Council Fathers are bringing up, right? And then it goes.
And anybody who hadn't listened to that episode, it's called "The Link Between the Jewish Marriage Customs and the Last Supper." Great episode
on our podcast.
Yeah. And and there's two of them, because then the other one is exploring the symbolism of wine and marriage in Jewish and Catholic traditions.
Yes.
So there's a lot going on.
Yeah. And so then the next thing is where Mary doesn't say anything, that this is the part that they bring where they say, your mother's looking for you. And Jesus says, who are my mother, my brothers, And so then this whole idea of fidelity. What is it to be faithful to Christ? To be faithful to Christ is to belong to his body, to belong to his family. And so one of the things that we have to deal with as believers is that many times our blood family is not part of the faith family. And so one of the things that we have to deal with then is the idea that I have to understand that my faith family is my family. This is who by blood, I now belong to this new group. And it's difficult because we have natural bonds. Obviously, we have natural bonds with our blood family. But my real blood family, the real blood family, is now the community of faith that I belong to. And Mary is seen as this model and image of this faithful disciple. And then the last thing that they bring in this number is the one the example that you brought up earlier, is Mary at the foot of the cross. And the faith stance is that Mary, even though she sees this is the consequence, right? We see her son enduring the passion. We see her son being rejected. We see her son being spat upon. We see her son being condemned to a very shameful death for a Jew, not just to be crucified, because to be hung on a tree is to be lost, we would say perdition, to be damned, right? To be in a situation where the Jewish faithful would see that this is a damning thing. This person is damned because they're being hung on a tree, but also a very shameful death because they were crucified naked. And again, I've always brought this up in other situations where I say, to this day, we still can't deal with the shame, because to this day we still have Jesus on a cross with a loincloth, because we really cannot deal with the idea of a naked Jesus, because it's not, and it has nothing to do with being prudish. It has to do with shame. It's the vulnerability. The person is completely exposed. And so this is, again, another situation. And then for Jesus to tell his mom, this is your son, the beloved disciple, right? This is your son. And for Mary then to take that, to believe that. This whole idea of this faith is that all these different things are being torn apart. Our world is being torn apart. There's, for those of us that don't have the, at this point, we don't have the luxury to be immaculate. What is it like for an immaculate heart to suffer this? It must be something that beyond my capacity to understand, or our capacity to understand. But also, there's this immaculate heart that is willing to say, I still believe. I know that God is faithful, even though this doesn't make sense, even though this does not, I cannot wrap my head around this. I don't know how, but I know that God is faithful. I don't know how this is going to turn out, but all I do know is that God is faithful. And that is then the stance of the faithful disciple that Mary represents for us. And there's this idea of what does faith encompass, right? And it is encompassing this ability, right? One of the things I tell people is that you genuinely have to believe that God is my loving Father. And that as my loving Father, He holds me in the palm of His hand. And as He holds me in the palm of His hand, I have to trust and believe that whatever happens in my life, whatever occurs in my life, for good or ill, is part of God's design and part of God's will for me to grow in my own sanctity, in my own redemption, my own journey. And I have to believe this, that yes, we live in a broken world. It's not a world that God wanted us to live in. He wanted us to live in Eden. But this is the world that we're living in. And so I have to believe that in spite of the brokenness of the world, in spite of my suffering for the consequences of my own decisions or other people's decisions, that somehow God, who is the God of history, will bring it all to completion. And it is for the health and well-being of each one of us. I have to believe that, or else life would be unbearable. And that is the faith stance. That is Mary's stance, the stance that we have. Our devotion to Mary is not just about praying the rosary. Our devotion to Mary is imitating the model of faith that she has exemplified for us.
Yeah, it's funny too. This morning's mass readings from Hebrews, Paul says, faith is the realization of what is hoped for and evidence of things not seen.
Yes. Yeah, those are great readings in this week and next week for Hebrews, from Hebrews. So, okay, then I think before we go on to Article 59, we have been talking about three different, we've been talking about the 5 steps, the 3 different steps ahead. Let me recap that, right? So there are 5 different steps of Mary's role in the salvation of history. One was the Old Testament prophecies, which was Article 55. 2 was the New Testament, Mary's obedience, which is Articles 56 and 57, which we just finished. The next point is point 3, Mary's receptive faith, which is, okay. I haven't had enough coffee yet. Okay, the step 2, you're going to have to edit this. Step 2, New Testament, Mary's obedience, Articles 56. Mary's receptive faith, which is step 3, which is Articles 57, 58. And now we go to step 4, or point 4. Mary's connection to Christ brings her to be intimately connected with the church. And this is Article 59. And then the 5th point, the church sees herself in Mary's assumption. That's part 3 of chapter 8. So we'll go to that next. But first, we have this point, Mary's connection to Christ brings her to be intimately connected with the church. Article 59 is Mary at prayer with the apostles in preparation for Pentecost. 59. But since it has pleased God not to manifest solemnly the mystery of the salvation of the human race before He would pour forth the Spirit promised by Christ, we see the apostles, before the day of Pentecost, persevering with one mind in prayer with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with His brethren. And Mary, by her prayers, imploring the gift of the Spirit who had already overshadowed her in the Annunciation. Finally, the Immaculate Virgin, preserved free from all guilt of original sin, on the completion of her earthly sojourn, was taken up body and soul into heavenly glory and exalted by the Lord as Queen of the universe, that she might be the more fully conformed to her Son, the Lord of Lords, and the conqueror of sin and death. Okay, again, the Council Fathers pack a lot into this one paragraph, this one number 59. This whole idea of persevering with one mind in prayer with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brethren. Okay, remembering that before Pentecost, the community is being persecuted. They're afraid they're going to be dragged out and be crucified.
Mm-hmm.
They're hiding. They don't know what to do. Then they have the experience of on the road to Emmaus. There's the experience of the resurrection. And then they're told to go and wait for him. And so they go and they're praying and they're excited. Now that they're excited, but they still don't understand what's going on. So they're in this crossroads of faith of trying to understand what they've experienced with the crucifixion and now the experience of the risen Lord. And now they're all coming together and praying and waiting for this coming of the Lord, whatever that might be. And so here we have then Mary then as a symbolic of not just Mary, the mother of Jesus, but Mary as model and image of faithful disciple, praying for and imploring God to manifest his will, right? What is your will for us? And so what is the will? The will is that the Holy Spirit comes down upon them and inflames them and blesses them, and they have the gift of tongues and they go forth to preach the good news of this reconciliation that is wrought in Jesus, the Lamb, right? And so here we have then this idea of Mary, who is the mother of Jesus, but also a model and image of the church. Then for us, then what is she exemplifying? She's exemplifying for us this idea of interceding for the church, praying for the church, praying for the coming of the Spirit. Are we following that model and example of Mary that prays for the well-being of the church, the greater church, the community of faith, as the community finds itself, right? And are we capable of doing it in that same spirit and dedication that Mary shows as is exemplified in the Gospels that we're told? And here again, I think it's for us to look at, do we intercede for the entirety of the church, and do we intercede for God's will? Or do we have a particular thing that we want and we try to convince God of that thing that we want? Again, different approaches, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's easy for us to get caught up in ourselves, right? This is kind of what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
But in all aspects of life, it's easy for us to shrink our world down to just us or just our family or just our job or just our whatever.
Right.
Right.
And it's the difficult part is, and this is true of all spirituality, well, Christian spirituality and about the rest of the world, is to get beyond our self-interest. Can I find a way to not be so worried about myself, right? Can I understand that I belong to a people, that my identity is not just me, but my identity is belonging to this people who has been now sealed with the blood of the Lamb, right? This greater community that I belong to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and that's like sin. When you sin, like you don't just hurt yourself, you hurt the church.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Which is part, I guess, why the public nature of confession.
Yes.
Right.
The communal. Yeah.
Definitely. Or communal. Yeah.
And so then they end this paragraph with referring to the assumption without necessarily saying the assumption about was taking up body and soul into heavenly glory. So this is then part of Mary's model and image exemplar of the faithful disciple, but also as model and image of believing church. All of us are called to share in that Trinitarian life of Father, Son, and Spirit. That's what we're called to. And so Mary, as immaculate then, conceived without sin, as the tabernacle of the covenant and the incarnation of the covenant, right? As that, we would say, physical temple where the word was conceived, right? The consequences of all this, the God's choice, her being immaculately conceived, all this, and then in Mary, what we have is in the Assumption, we have the promise of our own Assumption. Because in the Creed, we proclaim and believe that in the resurrection of the body, right? We as Catholics believe that our body is a part of who we are. We don't leave it behind. It will be transformed. It will be conformed to the image of Christ's transformed and glorified body. We don't know what that is, but we believe that and we proclaim that. And so in Mary, you have then, she is the first of us. She is the first of our kind as human persons. Not that Jesus is not a human person, but Jesus is true God and true man. We have in Jesus that unique marriage between God and man. But Mary as redeemed, Jesus is the Redeemer. Mary is the first of the redeemed that enjoys that promise that we all have. We all have that promise. If we are faithful disciples in according to the mercy and love of God the Father, the desire is that we share in that. And so Mary represents that church. Mary represents that community of faith. We would talk about, in old Catholic language, we would talk about the church triumphant. All the saints, right, that are with the Lord now. All the saints that are in glory with Mary. That she represents this community. And it is a community that we're all called to. So it's a matter of us then as pilgrims and looking at Mary, see that the consequence of my fidelity, the consequence of my being other-centered as Christ is, and to be other-centered as Mary was other-centered in the image and likeness and of Christ her Son. That the consequence of that is to live and to share in the Trinitarian life, in the fullness of my being. So Mary is fully who she is, who God meant her to be, as she enjoys the Trinitarian communion in that experience of love that exists between Father, Son, and Spirit. And that is what we're all called to. We're all called to that. That is what we are destined for. That is, for us, when Catholics talk about predestination, that's what they mean. We mean, for us, predestination means that God has desired for all of us to share in that Trinitarian life. Okay, it doesn't necessarily refer to those that are marked for salvation, those that are marked for damnation. Predestination for us is God has predestined us all to share in the Trinitarian life. Now, whether we want to go or not, that's up to us, right?
Yeah. And it's like, you can't even contemplate what that must be like either.
No, it's all speculation because we don't know.
Yeah, I heard somebody talking, I think it was like on Pints with Aquinas, but I don't know if he was quoting someone else, but he was saying how it's like if you were an infant in the womb and like you're wondering what it must be like after you're born. Like you'd have no idea.
Yeah, exactly.
You couldn't even imagine what it's like outside of the womb, and how similar it must be when we die.
Yeah. And so part of this whole idea of Mary being queen, right? And it's not because it's not like she entered a contest and like, okay, so I won the Queen of the Universe contest. No.
Yeah.
It is because Jesus is Lord of Lords. And
yeah,
his communion with us, his love for us is so deep and so transformative and unitive, is that we share in his kingship.
Yeah. When it's like the Queen Mother is like, the king might have, ancient times, the king might have X amount of wives or something like that, right? But there was only one queen, and that was his mother, right? And so then it makes sense for... There's
the queen. The queen mother is the mother of the king, and probably then the wife of a previous king. So here it would not be the queen mother. Here would be the queen. She would be the queen in the fact that we as church are both bride. We are bride. We're called to be bride of Christ. The church is the bride of Christ. And so Mary is the first of the bride of Christ, which is really weird for us to talk about because since Mary is his mom.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's not the bride in the way that, in that kind of way. It is the only way that we can speak of union in a way that is sort of comprehensible for us.
Yeah, it's one of those things where there's so many layers to the symbolism that it's like,
the only image, and this is why the Old Testament image of marriage, it's not that it's marriage, but it's the only thing that it's the only reference point that we have, and this reference point is like trying to equate a very smart I was going to say mammal, whatever, with Einstein. So it's radically different, but it's the only thing that we have is intelligence or intellect, right? And so here, the only thing we have is this idea of marriage, which is complete and total gift of self to another, right? So we don't.
Yeah, it's union.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it's really about union. It's not about marriage. It's about union and gift of self to others. So here, then, Mary's queenship is the queenship of the church, the queenship of the bride of Christ, not because it is a merit that they have earned, but it is a gift that the king gives to the bride. The union is so deep that they themselves become, you would say, regal, right? They share in the regal nature of Christ because of the depth of union. I know it's a very difficult concept to talk about. We're talking all about speculative theology and trying to talk about things that are difficult to talk about, but that's where the Council Fathers went, and so that's where we have to try to get in there and try to dive in there and find the richness of these images that they have used.
Yeah. Well, and they started at the very beginning of chapter 8. They're like, we're not trying to lay everything out there and define everything, right? That all of this is for the benefit of the church, right? And so these are things to contemplate, like what does it mean? Because, as men, we even perceive marriage as one way versus like my wife would think of it differently, right? Because she's a woman, so she has different kind of experience and intellect towards those kind of concepts. And so it's just something to pray with and something to really spend time in contemplation. Right. Well, what do you say? You want to wrap this one up here before we move on to
the Blessed Virgin and the Church, and which is the fifth point. The Church sees herself in Mary's assumption, that assumption being the effect of redemption. So that'll be the next point we cover.
All right. Well, Father, thanks for this.
You're very welcome. God bless.
Yeah, everybody, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Tell your mom we're praying for her.
I will. Bye.
Bye.